In this episode, I'm going to share Skinwalker encounters I found on the internet. I found these stories in this episode particularly bizarre and unsettling due to the behavior of the cryptids as described by the people who posted the stories. Two of them involve the supposed Skinwalker being in human form, and there is another detailing a terrifying encounter with a deer. As for the final story though, well, imagine having a dog look at you, but instead of seeing the face of a dog, you see a man's face instead. Alright, let's get into the stories. The first story of this episode comes from New Mexico, which is right in the midst of where the majority of Skinwalker encounters take place. Some would argue it is the only area where they can take place, but I wouldn't go that far. The original poster, or OP, tells the story told to him by his brother, who saw something bizarre while called out on an emergency job in the middle of the night in the early 2000s. The OP's brother was an electrician in the town of Gallup, New Mexico, which is right outside of Navajo Nation. If that town sounds familiar, it's because I did a story before that took place near Gallup. I thought I was reading the same story at first, but what happens in this encounter is nothing short of bizarre and disturbing. On the night of the encounter, the OP's brother and co-worker were on call. As luck would have it, there was an emergency out in the middle of nowhere. The call for his brother to respond came in at approximately 1 a.m. His brother and co-worker agreed to meet at the company stockyard, but after waiting for an hour or so, his co-worker still had not shown up. The co-worker had a newborn baby and desperately needed the extra hours, but unfortunately he had to rush his wife and the baby to the hospital, so he told the OP's brother he'd meet him on the job site. Due to the hazardous nature of the job, it is company policy to never go out alone, but with at least 2 people or more. It is also company policy to show up to jobs in a company truck. But being that he had just had a baby, the brother didn't want him to get written up, docked pay, or worse, so he agreed to meet his coworker at the job site. When the OP's brother arrived at the job site, he found that he was in the middle of nowhere. The desert was pitch black and there were no homes or buildings around at all. There were only dirt roads leading out to where he was, and they didn't have any streetlights on them. There was literally nothing for miles around. He waited a while for his coworker to show, but eventually decided he would assess the damage, and when his partner showed up, they would find a solution and fix the problem. He had parked his truck facing the pole with the headlights illuminating the area around the base of the pole he had to climb. After he climbed up the pole, something on the ground caught his attention. He looked down and could not believe what he saw. He was watching whatever it was, trying to make sense of it as it was transpiring below. He saw what he could only describe as a man crawling on all fours wearing the skin of a coyote. The skin was hanging from the man's back with the legs dangling around him. The man began circling his truck from a distance, patrolling the area, while slowly moving closer while circling. The circles he made around the truck got smaller and smaller until he stood up on 2 feet and looked through the driver's side window. The OP's brother describes the being on the ground as moving like it was confused, like he was unsure where the driver of the truck was. The OP's brother got a good look at the man and said he was covered in black paint and white clay. Headlights then appeared on the horizon as his co-worker was arriving at the scene, and the Skinwalker ran off into the darkness on all fours, having never figured out that he was up on that pole. When the co-worker arrived, they finished the job and left without further incident. I don't know why, but I find this much creepier than if the OP's brother had seen an animal doing what the man with the coyote skin draped over him was doing. Just something about the visualization, looking down and seeing a person wearing a coyote skin painted black and marked with white clay is unsettling. Given the location of their close proximity to Navajo Nation, I'm not sure what else the man could have been but a Skinwalker. Maybe at that point he hadn't transformed into an animal yet. Maybe he couldn't. Who knows for sure? All I know is I would never want to see anything like what he saw that night. Even if it was just a crazy person crawling around in the desert with a coyote skin on his back and not a skinwalker, that must have been terrifying. What do you think? Skinwalker or crazy man in the desert? The next story comes from the same region as the first, the American Southwest. However, this one takes place in Navajo Nation and was told to the original poster while she was growing up. The encounter took place at her grandparents' home where her aunt and two uncles still lived at the time. They lived in a rural community on the reservation. The OP's grandparents had left their 3 children home alone to attend a chapter meeting. The house had no power and it was about an hour after sunset. The OP's aunt and 2 uncles were getting ready for bed when they began hearing noises outside. It sounded like someone was moving things around out there. Her oldest uncle looked out the front window and saw a figure beside the truck parked outside. This was strange because the closest neighbor was miles away. He watched as the figure opened the vehicle's door and started rummaging through the personal belongings left in the truck. His brother and sister had joined him by the window at this point, and they all stood looking at the figure, freaked out by what they saw. But they knew they needed to do something. They grabbed a rifle and flung the front door open, aiming the gun at the being. The figure, shrouded in darkness, turned and started walking toward them. It was completely unfazed by the firearm aimed at it. Her uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. A rank stench her aunt describes as smelling like death hit them the closer the figure got to them. It was so strong it made her gag. Her uncle continued pulling the trigger on the weapon, but it would not fire. The figure continued to come closer to them, but headlights appeared in the distance coming up the road toward their home. Their parents were returning from their meeting. The figure looked toward the lights and retreated behind a tree where it ducked down and hid. The OP's oldest uncle, who was the one to see the figure in the first place, ran up to his parents' car, telling his father what happened while pointing toward the tree. His father, the OP's grandfather, got out of the car as her uncle pointed, seeing the figure's head peeking around the tree watching them. Her father ran to the house with the gun, went over to the stove, and grabbed a handful of ashes. He wiped the ashes all over the gun and on the bullets. He loaded one in the chamber. He then went out onto the porch and fired a shot at the tree. The fading echo of the gunshot rang in the darkness as the figure started running. The OP's grandfather chased after the being while her grandmother hurried the children inside. Her grandfather followed after the figure in his truck, and her uncle swears he saw a woman in the bouncing headlights, except she was running on all 4s. Their father eventually stopped the truck and started yelling about a local woman in Navajo. He told her he wasn't scared, that he knew who she was, and to leave his family alone. They heard a few days later that the woman the OP's grandfather was yelling about that night died. She ends her post by saying that she has always been told by her family that if you know the name of the Skinwalker, say it and it will kill them. And here we have another story where the Skinwalker stays in human form. The OP's uncle saw a human woman running on all 4s when the headlights hit her while her grandfather was chasing her. I have also heard before that if you know the Skinwalker's name and you say it, they will die. It's interesting to me that 2 different encounters, either in Navajo Nation or on the outskirts, involve supposed Skinwalkers in human form. It makes me wonder if the tales of them transforming are exaggerated. However, I have heard and read stories from Navajo people that talk about them transforming into animals. It was just a quick thought while reading these 2 encounters. I wonder why they stay in human form, especially while running away. An animal would be able to run much faster than a human on all 4s. Maybe it takes time to transform, and neither of the 2 in these first 2 stories had the time to do that. What do you think about this one? The next story comes from a poster who lives in Oregon. The original poster doesn't say exactly where she lives, just that it's a small town that isn't quite rural, but close to it. Everyone in her town has heard the cryptid stories about the Oregon woods. She describes them as being terrifying yet tempting, almost as if they beckon you into the woods to see for yourself. However, she hates the woods and stays out of them. The only time she ever goes into the woods is with her friends when they go hiking, but she makes sure to stay away from the areas that make her feel unsafe. She had all but dismissed the cryptid stories she had heard until she had a bizarre encounter with what she believes to be a skinwalker. The OP worked the graveyard shift with her friend at a local bakery, so they would always carpool to and from work. The bakery is located in a more rural area of the town, but the town's main road takes the girls almost all the way to their job. The road is well lit until you reach the outskirts of town, and there is usually traffic in one form or another with either cars or pedestrians. The OP lives about 10 minutes from the bakery. Due to road construction and them being stopped a few times before they could reach their job, they decided to take the back roads to work until the construction was finished. The only problem with their new route was that it was on the opposite side of town from the main road. It led them around the town on the outskirts on winding roads that had many twists and turns and made the OP's commute 30 minutes instead of just 10. The area was heavily wooded and had no light and very little traffic. There were homes along the way, but they were few and far between. They would see a lot of wildlife during the drive, including deer, possums, and squirrels. On the night of their encounter, they came around one of the sharp curves and the OP's friend who was driving slammed on brakes. The OP looked up from her phone to see a huge buck standing in front of them, staring directly at them. She describes this buck as the biggest she's ever seen. Not quite as big as a moose, but still huge. Between the buck's front legs was a dead raccoon she says was the size of a big dog. It was very clearly a raccoon as its face was pointed directly at them. When they looked back up at the deer, it was still staring at them, maintaining the eye contact. The OP's friend flashed her high beams and honked at the enormous animal in hopes of scaring it off, but it was unfazed. While maintaining the eye contact with the girls, the deer began walking slowly toward the car. Very freaked out by now, her friend throws the car in reverse, puts some space between them and the deer, and takes off swerving around it. The deer kept its eyes on them the entire time, even turning its head as the girls drove past them. They looked back after leaving the deer behind to see that it was standing in the middle of the road just staring at them. They finally rounded a curve and the deer disappeared from sight. The OP says the deer kept its eyes on them until they went around the curve. They talked about the incident a lot after it happened, but the one thing that stuck out to them, other than the weird eye contact from the deer, was that it seemed to be eating the raccoon it was standing over. When they really thought about it, they found it even more unsettling than the staring. The OP often wonders what would have happened if they had gotten out of their car, and is thankful they were smart enough not to. She has since paid a lot more attention to the lore surrounding the area in regard to cryptids since that night, and has even heard some unsettling noises and screams coming from the woods. She posted her story online because she thought people would enjoy it and because no one they have told believes them. It's a shame when people experience something like this and try to talk about it to people, but they aren't believed. It's a good thing there are places on the internet where people can post things judgment-free and are taken seriously. I think they did the right thing getting out of there, especially when the deer started walking toward them. The way she describes it maintaining eye contact throughout is unsettling. And the size of not only the deer but the raccoon as well? A thought crossed my mind when she said how big the deer was, given that she thinks it was a skinwalker. If this was a skinwalker and it turned into a deer that was larger than normal, then was the raccoon possibly a skinwalker too? Could they have fought and the raccoon was killed? Also, why was it standing over the raccoon eating it? Last I checked, deer don't eat meat. I found this whole encounter very bizarre. What do you think? The final story of this episode comes from the same poster who told the second story about her aunt, uncles, and the figure looking through the truck outside their home. This encounter is a retelling of what happened to her cousin, who lives in a community in Navajo Nation called Crown Point. It is located in the eastern agency of Navajo Nation. The OP's cousin was still in high school at the time and living with her parents. She made good grades, was very popular, and played on the basketball team. So for her to tell this story was out of the ordinary, according to the OP. Her tale also served to deepen the OP's belief in the traditional Navajo way and taboos associated with the culture. Her cousin was on her way home from basketball practice one evening. It was winter and the sun had set earlier, so it was already dark out by the time she set out for home. Streetlights lined the roads of her community, and when she got there, she noticed a pack of dogs. This was not out of the ordinary, as packs of stray dogs roam the rural communities. She thought nothing of it, but as she got closer to the dogs, she noticed something was off about them. There were 4 dogs, and they were all sitting in a circle facing each other. She realized just how weird this was when she told the story later on. She couldn't drive fast due to her being in the housing community, so she maintained her current speed and kept going. But after she passed the dogs, something in her peripheral caught her attention. She looked over to see one of the dogs from the group trotting alongside the car. She sped up some, but there were speed bumps placed in intervals on the road, forcing her to slow down every so often. But no matter how fast or slow she went, the dog kept pace with her car. Finally, she reached a stop sign and tried to keep her eyes forward, knowing that the dog was sitting beside her car. Her curiosity won out as an uncomfortable feeling settled over her and she looked over, but the dog was staring straight ahead. She watched the dog until it turned its head to look at her, but instead of the face of a dog looking back, it was the flat face of a man covered in hair smiling from ear to ear. Fear surged through her and she stomped on the gas pedal, pushing it all the way to the floor. She sped home and didn't dare look in her rearview mirror. She was barely able to make it into her home from being so weak from fear. Her mother rushed over to her as she began to sob. She told her mother what happened and she scheduled a meeting with the local medicine man the next day. That night, while she was sleeping, the OP's cousin tossed and turned all night, feeling very ill. She could hear people outside speaking in Navajo and laughing. This was not unusual, however, as they had plenty of neighbors. The medicine man told her the next day that she was very fortunate because she was not the target of the Skinwalker she saw. She just happened to cross paths with it while it was on its way to bring someone else misfortune. But if he had been there for her, it probably would have tried to kill her. He also told her the talking and laughing she heard while sleeping was the Skinwalker talking to his friends, telling them she saw him and that he scared her. After the encounter, the OP's cousin suffered a lot of illnesses and was forced to stop playing basketball for a while. She went through many what the OP calls ceremonies and eventually got back to normal. The OP heard the story many times on nights when the electricity would go out. She asked her cousin about it, who confirmed the story, but she doesn't like to talk about it. I think the creepiest part of this story isn't when the dog looked over the OP's cousin and had a human face, or even how the dog was trotting alongside the car no matter how fast or slow it was going. It was when she passed the 4 dogs sitting in a circle looking at each other. Did the cousin happen upon a Skinwalker meeting? Were they planning out the misfortune, as the medicine man puts it, they were about to bring to their targets? I'm glad the cousin was able to get out of there and make it home without incident. Skinwalker encounters seem to be commonplace in Navajo Nation. It's no wonder why Navajo people don't even want to utter the word Skinwalker. As for her feeling ill after the encounter with the cryptid, I don't doubt that. People often describe feeling off or unwell during or after their cryptid encounters. Some even develop PTSD. I'm just glad she eventually got back on her feet and made a full recovery. What do you think about this one? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.